Welcome to the CyberSangha podcast. CyberSangha is a program of free live broadcasts, launched in 2009 by renowned teacher and author Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. Join us as we draw on ancient Tibetan wisdom to discover how to connect with our best self and live to our highest potential. The following conversation, Savoring the Moment, Easing Pain Through Mindfulness, happened on June 11th, 2024, as a science and spirituality dialogue with Garland and Alejandro Chaoul. This was part of a year-long series of dialogues from 2024. This content is for informational purposes only. Listeners should consult medical professionals for any physical or mental health concerns. Please use headphones and do not meditate while driving or operating machinery.
Welcome, everyone, as you're still savoring the music and the voice of Rinpoche. Welcome you, everyone, to CyberSangha. For those who are new, CyberSangha is our space that was started by Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche as a way of really bringing us all, wherever we are, in a free way to bring both teachings and dialogues. And so today, I'm really delighted to have again Dr. Garland, and we'll be talking about savoring and how his research on mindfulness both allows us to ease pain, but also to work with addictions. And also, we're going to be talking about different kinds of meditation. So it's not just about mindfulness, but also particularly, I know his interest is in non-dual experiences. And so some of you probably read his bio, but I'll read a few parts of it, since he is a distinguished endowed chair in research and a distinguished professor and associate dean of research at the University of Utah at the College of Social Work. And he directs the Center of Mindfulness and Integrative Health Intervention Development. He's the Associate Director of Integrative Medicine and Supportive Oncology and Survivorship at the Huntsman Cancer Institute, and research health scientist in the Whole Health at the VA Medical Center in Salt Lake City in Utah. He has, as we will be talking, you'll hear the kind of innovative mindfulness-based healing interventions that he has developed, derived from his insights in cognitive and affective and neurobiological sciences, and particularly what he calls MORE, M-O-R-E, and we'll talk more about that, and how he brings different aspects of different traditions, including dzogchen and Mahamudra and some of the Kashmiri Shaiva Tantra. So really excited to have you, Eric. And he's also, besides a researcher, and maybe he'll tell us a little bit, because he didn't start as a researcher, he started as a practitioner and then also as a clinical licensed psychotherapist. And so from there, he decided to, well, let's engage in research. So Eric, welcome again to CyberSangha. It's great to have you.
So great to be here. Thank you so much.
So maybe let's start, if you think that that's a good place to start, with how you got into this area, because my memory is that your interest came from being a practitioner, and a lot of our audience are practitioners. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Sure. Yeah, I started this path many, many moons ago. I started meditating at the age of 18 years old, and a friend actually just taught me how to meditate. It was something that I just intrinsically had a connection with. I can't even really explain it. Who knows? Maybe it's some karmic past life sort of thing. But I just immediately went very deeply into the practice, and actually, upon reflection, I think even as a kid, much earlier as a young kid, I had this sort of penchant for experiencing non-dual states. I can remember my parents had a pool, and I would sink to the bottom of the pool. I'd hold my breath and sink to the bottom of the pool and look up at the light shining on the top of the water, the ripples at the top of the water, and would just disappear. And then of course I'd run out of breath. I'd have to swim to the surface, get another gulp of air, go back down and do it again. And I don't know how many hours I would spend doing stuff like that. But I guess that's sort of weird for a kid, but maybe that was an indicator of my path to come. So when I was in college, I was studying psychology and a little bit of neuroscience, but I quickly discovered that Indian and Chinese religion and philosophy seemed to have much more to tell me about the nature of consciousness than Western psychology at the time. And so I became pretty passionately focused on studying some of the classical works like Nagarjuna, and then some Taoism, and I was also particularly interested in the Vijnana Trada Siddhi Sastra and Vasubandhu. And so I was studying some of that literature. And actually, there was a time when I wanted to get my Ph.D. in comparative religion and philosophy. And I was heading in that direction, but life had other plans for me. So I became a clinician, and I was really interested in becoming a psychotherapist because I wanted to use really contemplative practices as a healing modality, and that really came from my personal practice experience, understanding the power of these deeper states of consciousness, including non-dual states, and the goodness that they could bring to the world. So I wanted to bring it into psychotherapy, and this was in the early 2000s, where mindfulness wasn't as integral in psychotherapy as it is today. And I was also pretty ignorant. I didn't know anything about MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And so I had to just, if I wanted to introduce meditation into psychotherapy, I had to figure out how to do it on my own. And so that's what I did as a practicing psychotherapist, working with patients with psychiatric conditions, depression, anxiety, PTSD, but also addictions and psychosomatic conditions, including working with people with some pretty severe chronic pain conditions. And so I tried to work this whole thing out. How do I introduce meditation into psychotherapy? And that became the genesis of mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, or MORE.
Great, thank you. And we'll get more into more. But yeah, and I remember meeting you. I think the first time was actually at the Consortium of Integrative Medicine, and then at some of the Mind and Life, of course, where we and I always love that, for those in the audience who may not know me, my background is actually, my PhD is in religious studies. And so when I got into health, I was also kind of the odd one there, because a PhD in religious studies and in integrative health didn't fit that well. But I remember talking with you at the consortium, and it's like, oh yeah, there are people that are interested in these areas. Um, and particularly what's really interesting is, as you said, in these areas, what people know the most is this area of mindfulness in the way that it's being brought by John Kabat-Zinn and others in terms of MBSR, MBCT, and so forth, which is very useful. But sometimes this area that I know you're particularly interested in, you mentioned Nagarjuna and this whole area about being meditation in emptiness or spaciousness, the non-dual experience, which is not so much emphasized in these other modalities. And partly is also because we want to bring it in a very simple way, right? Because we are like, we don't want to push them into. So how is that gradual way for you? How did you manage to bring a protocol, a program where you were able to gradually get them into some of these experiences?
Great question. I think it's a really interesting conversation we could have around the history of the rise of mindfulness-based practices in science and health. I feel fortunate to have been a part of that process uh, as a fellow of the Mind and Life Institute. Which, for your audience who's not familiar with the Mind and Life Institute, this was the world's premier scientific organization for the study of mindfulness and meditation that was established by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and a neuroscientist from Chile, Francisco Varela. And it was this incredible convergence of cognitive scientists and neuroscientists and contemplatives, and really on equal footing to create this synergy to launch the study of meditation and mindfulness. So one of the first things I think that we did as a field was to try to demystify the entire process, as you say, to simplify the process into mechanisms that could easily be measured by cognitive science. And we did this in order to legitimize the field, to use the most rigorous methods of cognitive science and neuroscience to understand the phenomenon of mindfulness and meditation. And that approach really worked quite well. And so it went from this totally fringe thing to what it is now, which is mindfulness is being taught in every major health center in the world. And the NIH has given hundreds of millions of dollars to study the science of mindfulness and meditation as a healing technique. So I think that was all a benefit to the field and to the world. But something was lost in that process, and that was, what are the original soteriological roots of this practice? What is the intention of the practice? Is mindfulness merely intended to be a means of reducing stress? Was it really intended to simply be a means of regulating attention? Or is it the handle on a door that can be opened up to reveal a deeper truth about life and reality? And so in terms of my own personal path to this, I mean, I'm a full tenured professor, so now I can do the crazy stuff that I always wanted to do, that I was that I was afraid to do and afraid to talk about earlier in my career, which really was the thing that pushed me into this whole field to begin with, which were those non-dual experiences of transcending the limited sense of self and feeling a deep sense of interconnectedness with the world around me, or even so far as a complete unity. And those experiences do happen to patients, and they do happen to people who have very little mindfulness experience. Sometimes it happens. It happens spontaneously, and Ali, you could probably tell us from a traditional perspective why that is. Why some people can experience the tastes of that state very quickly, and I think that's consistent with some of the direct pointing traditions within Tibetan Buddhism that you know about more than I do. But regardless, as an observation, just as a purely clinical observation, having taught mindfulness to more than 1,000 patients, and then doing my own research studies with many thousands of patients, we find that it's not uncommon for people with relatively little meditation experience to sometimes slip into moments where they do have this experience of self-transcendence. And so after about 10, or let's say, what year is it? Let's say, yeah, maybe 10 years into my scientific career, I started to wonder, hey, maybe we should start to study this thing, since people are talking about it, and they seem to report when they have these tastes of this self-transcendent experience. They seem to report pretty profound clinical benefits, such as cessation of chronic pain, so pain relief in that moment, or the cessation of craving in the case of somebody with an addiction. And so, so why is that? What are the mechanisms that explain that? And so then I started to try to explore this more rigorously, and I can tell you more about those studies if you're interested in what we did and what we found.
Of course. And as you say, interesting enough, what's beautiful about this convergence of science and spirituality and mind-body practices, and as you say, the Mind and Life Institute being such an incredible place, and and actually it's been interesting. It just reminds me the beauty that they have about being, you have research fellows like you, we have contemplative fellows like me, they have now kind of change maker fellows. So this idea that you can come to these area from different perspective, and that's the beauty, these dialogues. And in these ancient traditions, they don't think so much about mechanisms, right? It's not about what is the mechanism, but they're very interested in how those experiences change your mind, change your perspective, right? And so sometimes, like what you were saying, lying, in the pool, holding your breath, looking up, that experience, right? So as a scientist, you probably can explain the mechanism, but as a child, it's that sometimes, what the closest word that I like, and there's been research in this, is awe, right? This aspect of, oh, I remember the first time I went to the Grand Canyon, relatively close to you, and just, wow, right? This moments. And in the Tibetan Buddhist practices in Burn, they talk about these moments of Hirawan, these moments that could be from practice, but could also be from an experience like, choo, a sneeze. Can you stay in that? Or orgasm, or moments that kind of push you into this experience that, for a moment at least, you're out of your usual boundaries of what you grasp. And if you're able to stay there, and as Rinpoche and all these teachers say, rest in that, there's a door that opens, right? And so, again, in the Tibetan Buddhist and Burn and most Chinese and other, they're not really looking so much at the mechanisms, but what they realize, oh, these practices have these effects. Let's keep on doing them. So now having people like you and so many others kind of researching is like, oh, look at the mechanisms. And now with that, you're able to bring this to a broader audience. And that's part of the beauty as well. So yeah, take us a little bit.
And to build off what you're talking about, that concept also shows up in Kashmir Shaivism. It's actually a central concept, the concept of wonderment or amazement, which happens naturally when we encounter something beautiful, or as you said, something awe-inspiring. And it happens, it's an unfoldment from the process of savoring, which I know we wanted to get to in this conversation. But there is and that's a term that I've used, which comes out of the affective science literature that has been an organizing principle in developing the mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement therapy that I've developed and that I teach. But it has ancient roots, at least within Kashmir Shaivism. But I would be really interested actually to hear from you about the parallels to the practice from Tibetan Buddhism. But this idea that when we experience something beautiful, when we experience something wonderful, and we have this moment of amazement, we have this moment of wonderment. So that means our senses are tuned completely onto the experience, to the point at which we become so absorbed in the experience that that's all there is. And that the normative subject-object dichotomy which exists of I'm a subject and I'm observing this object, that is completely collapsed in the moment of wonderment. There's no distinction at all. there's sort of two things that happen. One is that, of course, that experience is accompanied by bliss, powerful, positive, affective state, not only in emotional, but also an embodied state of bliss that many people describe as an energy or a warmth or an expansiveness, or in Kashmir Shaivism is known as spanda, a vibration of consciousness. But then the other thing is, in that moment, there is this quieting of the normal sense of self, or maybe even a complete temporary cessation of the normal sense of self, as you become completely absorbed and immersed in the experience. And that's what I call savoring, or at least that's savoring sort of at its deepest essence. And it took me a long time actually to realize this, that savoring could actually be a potential pathway to non-duality, because of this connection between this, because the act of savoring is really the act of connecting subject and object, to unifying subject and object, if you will.
Yeah. It's interesting, all these, when we start reflecting, and I'm sure the audience is reflecting too, in their own experiences of savoring, that, a lot of times we think, well, they have to be in the gompa, right? Or in the meditation, or in the, in whatever the formal practice. But there's so many others. In fact, there's so probably many more others outside of the cushion, to put it in one way, um, and start exploring both. And those become really incredible supports for our practice, right? So, for example, being in nature, or savoring a cup of tea, or or experiences, and for some reason, when you were talking, I just was reminded of an experience that was actually with my teachers, and it was, many times we see different teachers individually, and then we have the refuge tree, and we talk about the refuge tree and the lineage. And I remember, one of the things that, one of the many things that I value of Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche is always he used to bring his teachers now, that they're older, they can't come, or one passed away. So he brings this younger generation. But I remember, back in 93, when he brought, for the Yongsin Tenzin Namdak, Lopen, who's turning 100 next year. And I had met him a couple of years earlier, and I had met Rinpoche. But when I saw them together, there's something that happened, actually still today, this feeling, my hairs are like, there's a moment of wow, and that almost everything disappears. But it's not just that everything disappears. There's something that the Tibetans call ding. There's a certainty. There's a certainty of this is it. That I don't know how to explain, but so it's not just that everything disappears, but it's very grounding at the same time. There's such a certainty in that moment. Does that make sense to what
Yes.
you're? Yeah.
Yes. Definitely. Well, it's making me wonder if it's parallel to the concept, I think, in the Chinese term sujan, self-so, that this experience, this moment, has no other purpose than for itself in this moment. It's self-evident. The experience is self-evident. It's self-manifesting, and the tantrics compare that to the quality of independence or freedom. That this experience is self-so, and therefore it stands by itself, which is in some way an actually interesting contradistinction to this idea, Nagarjuna's idea of codependent arising, but we could geek out on contemplative philosophy for a long time.
Tell
But
me,
yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. And like you said, it's totally grounding in that experience, because you're really, I mean, you're just appreciating the beauty of what is, the reality of what is.
yeah, so for me, it's not, I know there are other experiences that people talk about, which is almost like out. You feel you're totally out. But this is like, for me, totally grounding. And what I was wondering, can you say anything about the mechanism? Is there something in that about the inner mechanisms of our mind, of our body, of what's going on? Actually, can we explain it?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a little, but I don't, I think we don't know a lot about this yet. But what I can just, let me speak from my own data. So we've studied mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement as a treatment for a wide array of conditions, but I've focused a lot of my energy on studying this therapy as a treatment for opioid misuse and addiction, and also to reduce opioid use in people with chronic pain. And the mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement therapy, the MORE therapy, is a highly efficacious treatment. We've tested it in a number of trials funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. So there's a really strong body of evidence behind this therapy to show that it actually is an effective treatment for reducing pain and addiction. But we've also been interested in the mechanism. How does the treatment work? Not only does it work, but how is the treatment working? And so to answer this question, there are two studies that I'd like to talk to you about. So, and I'll speak about these chronologically. So the first,
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but just to tell the audience a little more about all the components of MORE,
oh,
would it be
thank you.
helpful? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so MORE is an approach that really unites three great traditions within psychotherapy. The first is mindfulness training, the second is cognitive behavioral therapy, and the third is positive psychology. And it draws techniques from these approaches and weaves them together into a structured 8-session therapeutic approach. And there are three key techniques in MORE. The first is mindfulness, the second is reappraisal, and the third is savoring. So I think this audience probably knows what mindfulness is, so I don't know if I need to talk about that, but just enough to say that MORE includes, is completely rooted in the practice of mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of body sensations, and then all of the mindfulness techniques and MORE also include some pointing towards the non-dual, by asking people to become aware of the aspect of awareness that is like space. So all the techniques point to that at sort of the end of the practice. But MORE also includes techniques that are labeled as reappraisal. So reappraisal is the process of reframing an adverse life event so as to see facing that adversity as a learning opportunity, or an opportunity to find meaning in the face of challenge. And actually that technique, although it comes right out of cognitive therapy, I think it's pretty consistent with some of the Lojong practices in Tibetan Buddhism, namely the practice of taking adversity as the path to enlightenment. And then the third component of MORE is savoring, which is this process of becoming aware of pleasant life events and objects, and then turning attention towards pleasant life events and objects, and then to really extract all the goodness that one could experience from that event. So when we're savoring, we're focusing our senses on the object, what is beautiful, what is pleasant, in every sensory modality. But then what happens as we practice savoring is we begin to notice positive emotions arising in the mind, or pleasant sensations arising in the body. And then when we notice the positive inner feeling, we turn our attention inward and we savor the positive inner feeling and then absorb that deeply within ourselves. The metaphor is like water seeping into the soil. So we allow ourselves to really immerse ourselves in that positive experience. And as you said, Ali, to rest in that state. So those are the techniques and more in brief, and we could get more into that specifically. But in terms of understanding the mechanism and how this is affecting the brain and the body, we've done a number of studies where we brought patients into the lab and showed them pictures on a computer screen. We showed them images of beautiful, healthy, natural pleasures. So beautiful sunsets, lovers holding hands, smiling babies. And we also showed them images of opioids, of drugs on the computer screen. And these were patients who had issues with addiction. And we measured patients' brain activity with EEG. We measured their heart rate variability to measure their autonomic response. And what we found was that going through 8 weeks of this MORE program, that the brain and the body became more sensitive to natural, healthy pleasure. And we also found that the brain became less reactive to viewing the drug images. So the brain was becoming more sensitive to natural, healthy pleasure. It was becoming less reactive to the craving related stimuli. And what was really quite amazing was that the more sensitive the person became to the natural, healthy pleasure, the less they craved the drug. So on some level, this practice is really retraining the reward system in the brain to help the person to learn how to appreciate the natural beauty and value in the healthy, life-affirming parts of their existence, and that helps them to then be less dependent on the drug. So that was one set of findings that really was critically important to my whole research program and really pushed the evolution of this therapy. And I think scientifically also pretty profound, the notion that you could actually help somebody heal from addiction by helping their brains and bodies reclaim the ability to experience natural, healthy pleasure. But that doesn't speak to the non-dual piece. So that's the second study that I could tell you about. Do you want to comment on that first one before we move on?
Well, I mean, no, I think you did such a great job of making it very simple. But I think it's the only part that I was wondering, do you think it is kind of an exchange of one for the other, or is it more profound than that?
That's really interesting. I do tend to think about it as almost as if it was a balance. And we know that from addiction neuroscience that as a person becomes more addicted, as they fall deeper into the trap of addiction, the normal reward value that the person puts into the people, the activities, the things that they cared about in life, that becomes hijacked by the drug. So the drug gains primary self-relevance. It becomes the most important thing in the person's life. And this sort of hijacking of value occurs on a neural level as a result of changes in dopamine in the brain's reward system. So in effect, I think a simple way of understanding it is the drug basically steals the pleasure and meaning out of the healthy parts of life. And so in a sense, I think this therapy is doing some of that rebalancing. It's shifting the value back to the natural, healthy reward. And that is producing the reduction in craving and addictive behavior. Now, does it go deeper than that? That was your question. And I think yes, it can go deeper than that. Because ultimately what it's doing, I think, is pointing to the second study that I was going to tell you about. It's pointing to the fact that it is possible for us as humans to achieve a stimulus independent form of happiness.
Mm.
Which really we have to go deep into the weeds on savoring to get at that. But I think in the practice itself, and I think this is pretty consistent with some ancient contemplative practices as well. When we're savoring the object, and then the positive inner feeling arises, then we're savoring the positive inner feeling. And so essentially at that point, consciousness is savoring itself.
Mm.
Or
Beautiful.
resting in itself, resting in its own inherently blissful nature. So the object is the stimulus, if you will, but eventually we become we even transcend that.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's beautiful because I find that a lot of times in most practices, and particularly sometimes in body practice, as you know, one of what I do most is Tibetan yoga. And what I find is a lot of times people love the movement, they do it, and we finish with the sound, ha, pe, and then they want to immediately go to the next movement rather than savor the experience, right? As Rinpoche, with this in this resting moment, that kind of, if I could use the word mechanism, or that process happens where there is a union, there is that external and internal union, and the moment of inner savoring. For me, I feel it like inner smile in my heart, right? So this there's something there that as you stay with it, as many times our teachers would say, the experience remains fresh in that way. Stay with it. And then you do the next. But many times we're more like, okay, doing, whether it's a particular movement, whether it's another breath, another sound, another whatever it is, right? And partly what we're told over and over again, it's in the resting that happens. And I think in the resting, what's happening is the savoring, right? It's that together. And for many of the audience, there's a beautiful teaching by a teacher early on in the 8th century called Dawa Johnson, that it's kind of vision is mind, mind is empty, empty is clear light is union, and that union is great bliss, right? So there's this process that could happen in a moment or it happens gradually. But it is this process of, and the great bliss, as you had mentioned before, it's that savoring. It's because the moment that we want to name it, we say, I got it, as most of our teachers would say, you just lost it, right? But if you're just staying with it, that's the beauty. And I imagine, I don't know if you've looked into this population as they rested and able to stay with it, if the changes were more persistent and longer and maybe more profound.
That's a great question. So that leads to the second study. So building upon this savoring of the object, we wanted to understand what happens in this state of rest and union. So we brought patients into the lab and we had them practice mindfulness meditation, and we recorded their brain activity with EEG. And what we found was that patients going through the mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement program, that they reported to have increases in self-transcendent experiences during meditation. So experiences of the sense of self beginning to quiet down or maybe even fade away. the sense of oneness between the self and the world around them, this sense of unity with the universe. And these experiences were also coupled with this affective bliss, this sense of blissful energy arising in the body, blissful warmth, the inner smile, as you describe it. And the deeper the states of self-transcendence the patient achieved during meditation, the more powerfully their brains began to emit this theta EEG oscillation in the midline regions of the brain. So the frontal midline theta increase in activity was significantly correlated with going more deeply into this transcendent experience during meditation. And the more powerful the frontal midline theta began to increase in the brain, the greater the reduction in opioid use and opioid misuse, even 9 months later after the treatment. So the patients who were able to go most deeply into the state of self-transcendence during meditation were able to produce these brain signatures that had this anti-addictive property, which was really, really pretty amazing. What's also very interesting about this is that frontal midline theta EEG activity has been studied very extensively. So we know, science knows that when we're in a deep state of concentration, when we're concentrated on a task, we're deeply absorbed into a task to the extent to which when there are distractors popping up, they don't even faze us because our concentration is so strong. The brain is emitting a high degree of frontal midline theta EEG activity. So what does that have to do with self-transcendence? In fact, typically frontal midline theta is considered a biomarker of cognitive control, of mental control, of self-control. So on surface value, maybe it seems like that is like, why would that be linked with self-transcendence? But what I personally think is going on is that when we're concentrating our mindfulness on an object, and we could be savoring, it could be savoring a beautiful sunset, or listening to the sound of a bird singing in a tree. But the object could be the sensation of our breath moving into our nostrils, or it could be the object of the body moving doing one of these Tibetan yoga practices. When we become so focused on the object that the distinction between the observing subject and the object that we're observing begins to fade, it begins to collapse, and there is this total absorption of the observer into what you're observing. Of course, that takes total concentration. It takes deep concentration. So there is this increase in frontal midline theta, but that is opening the door to this experience of transcending the normal subject-object dichotomy. And then like you said, the next step is to rest. And we really, I don't think we captured in this particular study, I don't think we were able to capture the moment of rest as much as we were the moment of really attentional effort to open the door. And what happens in the brain when the door is opened? I haven't done that work myself, but there's one more part to the story, which is the other thing that we know about frontal midline theta is that when we're deeply concentrated in a task, and there's this increase in frontal midline theta, there is a decrease in the brain's default mode network. And for your listeners who don't know what the default mode network is, there's a network of brain structures that when our mind is wandering and we're ruminating or lost in thoughts about ourselves, we fall into sort of the habit of thinking about our life story, maybe worrying about ourselves, becoming self-absorbed, let's say. There's a characteristic network of brain structures that becomes activated, and that's called the default mode network. But when we're actively engaged in a cognitively demanding task, the default mode network quiets down and frontal midline theta increases. So maybe what we're seeing here is that when we enter into this deep state that leads to this union, and we rest in the state, there is what we're seeing on a neural level is a quieting of the brain's default mode network, which is really a quieting of the normal sense of self.
Wonderful. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you actually to lead us in a practice of savoring. But before that, I had one more question that I think might be important, which is how, you put together this wonderful protocol. Now, you start with mindfulness or focused attention and training of the mind, and then engaging in a savoring that maybe we are used to. But now with this training, things change, right? It's not the same way of savoring. How important it's almost like a preliminary in the way I'm thinking. Does that make sense? How important
Absolutely.
is that preliminary for then to have the experience that you see and that you're seeking for the relief of your population?
It's absolutely critical, and you're completely correct. So we in mindfulness oriented recovery enhancement, uh, for the first 3 weeks, we're teaching mindfulness meditation, just building this foundation of stabilizing the mind, developing attentional control, gaining meta awareness, under the awareness of awareness and how our minds work, and that's really the platform, the preliminary, as you say, before we introduce savoring. And I think it's critical in order to savor with awareness rather than just falling into uh, craving or attachment, uh, or mindlessness in the middle of a pleasurable activity. So I think having the platform of mindfulness enables us to savor with full awareness, to savor with meta awareness, and to savor, and also to savor more deeply.
Wonderful. So, since the majority of our audience have had some sort of practice, so they've had some preliminaries in this, would you be so kind to guide us into a practice?
Yes, I'd love to. So why don't I lead us all on the savoring meditation? So if you have a pleasant object near you, wherever you are by your computer, maybe a plant, pretty plant, a flower, beautiful rock, a piece of art, a photograph of some joyous moment or some beautiful place. If you have some present, beautiful or meaningful object around you, then you can gather that up for this practice. And if you don't, you could use a memory of a beautiful experience you had or a very meaningful moment that you had. You could also use a memory, but I'm going to use an object. So let me grab something off my desk here. I've got this beautiful geode. So once you've gotten your object, we'll begin this practice the way we begin all of the practices and more, with a bit of mindfulness. And so I would invite you to allow your eyes to close, or they can remain open and relaxed on a spot in front of you. And turning your attention inward, just noticing the sensation of contact between the back and the legs and the cushion of the seat. And we have this word, contact. But what is it really? Perhaps a sensation of warmth, or heaviness, or tingling, or some other sensation. Just noticing those sensations now. That's right. And then when you're ready, shifting the focus of your attention to the sensation of the breath moving into the nostrils as you breathe in. Just noticing the natural sensation of the breath in this moment. Just noticing its warmth or coolness. That's right. And if the mind wanders, you can just notice where it wanders off to. Acknowledging and accepting that thought or feeling. Then letting it go. And gently but firmly return the focus of the attention back to the breath. And when you've done that, you can allow your eyes to open and you can pick up your object of savoring. You can begin to focus your awareness on this object, appreciating the visual beauty of this object, appreciating the pleasant colors and textures, the patterns of light and shadow. Really just drinking in the visual beauty of this object. And perhaps you can allow your gaze to soften. Instead of trying to pick out individual details of the object. Just gazing at this object. Perhaps the way an artist would look at it, as just a pattern of color and shape and light and shadow. That's right. Perhaps becoming aware of the space around the object. Becoming aware of where the object meets its background. becoming aware of this one whole pattern. You may soon begin to notice that somehow the space between you and the object begins to close. And you may feel a sense of closeness or interconnectedness or even oneness with this object. And when you notice positive feelings in the mind or the body, you can turn your attention inward to savor the positive inner feeling, basking and relishing in that positive inner feeling. Soaking, bathing in that positive inner feeling and breathing it into the center of your being, like water seeping into soil. Allowing it to expand naturally on its own. That's right. And then returning your attention back to the object to savor its other qualities. If the object has a sound, then savor the sound. Or perhaps savoring the touch of the object, feeling the object against your skin. Or enjoying its scent. And again, when you notice positive feelings arising in the mind or the body, you can turn your attention inward to savor the positive inner feeling. Soaking and bathing in this positive inner feeling. Breathing it into the center of your being, like water seeping into soil. That's right. Resting awareness in this experience now. And if the mind wanders to meaningful thoughts or associations, that's okay. That's what minds do. They wander. You can just appreciate those insights and meanings now. Or offer up a moment of gratitude for allowing yourself to have this experience. Then complete this practice, dedicating the fruits of this savoring practice to your higher purpose, to alleviating suffering, the spirit of compassion. And completing this practice, allowing your eyes to open, coming back to this meeting. Thank you for sharing that practice with me.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was wonderful. Thank you, thank you. And I really appreciated how you brought not just that first way of connecting to the object, but really allowing all the different senses to enhance that. Yeah. So kind of thinking of a more holistic way rather than always just thinking of the active ingredient, right? But really the composite. So thank you.
Yeah, it's really nice to do that activity with something like a flower, because it not only is its visual beauty, but then there's the scent of the flower and the softness of the petals, and then the green stem, so you can appreciate the life force in the object, and then of course the space that enfolds the object from what it arises. So the whole thing is a there's a bunch of beauty in this world if we just take the time to appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Uh, and still savoring it. And thank you again for coming. I don't know if there's any last things that you want to say to our audience as we close.
No, it's been wonderful to have this conversation with all of you. If you are a therapist, somebody who works to try to help patients with suffering, I do provide training in mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, so you can use it with your own clients. So if that interests you, just go to my website and you can find information there. But I just really appreciate the time with you. I always enjoy to connect with you and love to learn from you.
Thank you, Eric. Same here. And just to let the audience know, a couple of upcoming events. On June 20th, there'll be another event of questions and answers from the new app, the community app. So it's on June 20th, 2:30 p.m. New York time. And on June 21st, our usual full moon, starting at 10 a.m. New York time and going for 24 hours. So we keep on passing the baton all over the world. And so anyone can join at any time. And and thank you, Milos, and all the team behind to make this possible, Polly and everyone helping for this. Thank you, Eric, also for, I see your website there. I'm going to read it again, drericgarland.com. And again, as always, great to see you. Hopefully, we'll get to see you in person again soon. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the CyberSangha podcast. If you'd like to learn more about CyberSangha, visit us online at cybersangha.net.